So you served on the COSO ERM Advisory Council, where some, I think, really terrific guidance was developed to help to promote integration of risk into both planning and decision making. So what are some of the first steps that organizations should take if they want to move along that line and toward the COSO principles? And what can boards do to help accelerate that adoption?
Well, I think that one way of looking at this is thinking about kind of where we are, our current state. So in the aftermath of the financial crisis, and companies started focusing more on risk, and boards started focusing on their risk oversight. I think most companies started boiling it all down to addressing three questions. What are our risks? How are we managing them? And what, how do we know? And so that's kind of the current state. And the question you gotta ask, is that really enough? And given the pace of change today. And so the COSO framework has come out, and the COSO board and PwC are to be congratulated for an outstanding job on that. And it was a privilege to work on the COSO Advisory Council with the board and with PwC. But they came out and with this framework, and my advice, I have two suggestions to management and one suggestion for boards as they start using this framework. And of course, the ISO just is coming out with or has just come out with a risk framework. And so whatever framework a company decides to use, there are two things I think management should do. One is to position the organization as an early mover. That means to be an early mover, you've got to be able to recognize market opportunities and emerging risk on a timely basis. If you don't, if you can't, it's game over. And so, but that's just half the battle. To be an early mover, once you have knowledge of market opportunities and emerging risk, you got to act on that knowledge. If you don't, and it's a serious matter, it's game over. So those two aspects of being an early mover are very important. The other aspect, suggestion I would have for management, is to improve risk reporting. I think the three questions I outlined as part of the current state, they're fine. Got no problem with them. They're great. God bless those who pursue those questions. But there are three questions that I think are highly germane to effective risk reporting. And they are that, answering the question, are we riskier today than we were yesterday? Okay. Are we entering a riskier time, and why? And so I think that, those three questions create more actionable, if you can answer those three questions, you have more actionable information for decision making, and your decisions will be more risk informed. If you're unable to answer those three questions, you won't have actionable information for decision making, and your decision making won't be risk informed. So those are my two suggestions for management. The suggestions I have, one suggestion I have for board, Jay, is to encourage management when using these risk frameworks to position the company to be an early mover, and to encourage management to improve its risk reporting. And to that point, boards may get lots of fancy reports at board meetings, lots of graphs, risk maps, heat maps, and all that stuff. It's great. But they ought to ask, how much manual effort is required to produce all this stuff? And if you got a lot of manual effort underneath the covers and behind the scenes to produce this stuff, what does that say about your ability to have near real-time information in the hands of decision makers? It doesn't speak well to that.
So you mentioned a couple of different frameworks, and the important thing is to pick one, be an early adopter, and move with it. So whether it's COSO, whether it's ISO, the point is to have some kind of a framework that the board and leadership can trust and get behind and understand, and frankly, be able to implement it. So, okay. So last fall, you wrote an article. It was very interesting. It talked about the importance of companies being properly positioned to face the future confidently. I found that word to be particularly interesting. In particular, you said that a confident organization routinely identifies the risks that are arising from, as well as the risks to, executing the strategy. This is going to help ensure that the most critical exposures are managed effectively. Can you elaborate just a bit more on that? How does this type of focus help boards drive performance and be more confident about the future?
Well, the reference to facing the future with confidence, that's the Protiviti tagline. And we like to think we're in business to help companies face the future with confidence. And there are various attributes to facing the future with confidence. And we've written about those. You're talking about one of those attributes, and that's, undertaking risk and being an effective risk taker. And, one article I wrote giving an example of that it referred to Walt Disney.
Mm-hmm.
And when you study the life of Walt Disney, it's amazing. The man was the consummate risk taker.
Mm.
He took big risk. He made big bets. And it's a fascinating life experience to read about. But when you think about risk and taking risk and doing it with confidence, the COSO framework, Jay, came out with a suggestion that there's three aspects of integrating risk with strategy. And, the first one is very common, and that is to assess, to focus on monitoring and managing the risk to the execution of the strategy. And that's very common. A lot of companies when they start trying to elevate their line of sight on risk to strategy, that's where they focus,
Mm-hmm.
on the execution, the risk to the execution of the strategy. There are, however, two other dimensions that COSO recommend. And one is the risk from the strategy. So when you're looking at different risk alternatives, risk options, different strategic options, there may be different risk profiles that are
Mm-hmm.
associated with each of those options. So we should understand the risk-reward balance with respect to each of those strategic alternatives. So that's the risk from the strategy. The other aspect, the dimension of that COSO mentioned, was the alignment. The risk of the strategy is not effectively aligned with the organization's mission, vision, and values. And
Mm-hmm.
getting back to Walt Disney, he made big bets,
Mm-hmm.
but they were inextricably linked to his mission, his vision, his core values. Inextricably linked. Directionally, he was going where he wanted to go. And that's the reason why he made those bets. He could make the business case for those bets to his board, and they supported those bets. So I think those are three dimensions of integrating risk with strategy. And when you do that, then you have the risk appetite dialogue between management and the board, getting on the same page as to the risk we're willing to accept, the risk we want to avoid, and the strategic, financial, and operational parameters within which we want to operate.
Mm-hmm.
When we have that understanding, we can drive that down into the organization with risk tolerances that are linked to performance objectives. So this is, from a risk perspective, this is how we get the board, the CEO, and his or her executive team can get confident that the organization is taking risk on an informed basis and operating within the parameters of that risk appetite. And alignment is what engenders confidence. Alignment of the strategy to mission, vision, and core values, an alignment of the organization, its processes, and people with the strategy. That engenders confidence.
It's that alignment that's so critical. In one of the articles you published last month, Jim, you talked about, I think it was 10 ways to enhance leadership engagement. And the purpose was to help executive management and the board remain engaged and aligned over time, which you just touched on. When these leaders consider the impact of external changes on their business, you suggested that they focus on critical assumptions that underlie the corporate strategy. This is going to allow them to assess the strategic risks and deal with that uncertainty we've been talking about. And then to test the assumptions, you mentioned things like scenario planning as a technique to expose risk and the upside, the opportunity piece.